Benvenuti a GiovedìScienza, questa sera
Welcome to Science on a Thursday. GiovedìScienza will be talking about digital revolutions. We have this evening's guests, Juan de Martin, professor of IT at the Turin Polytechnic, where he's also co-director of the Nexter Center for Internet and Society. He's also, you can read him also in the Repubblica. And then we have Mezzalama from the Turin Polytechnic. He teaches processing systems and has written over 150 papers, maybe, yes. He doesn't know how many, for scientific journals, and he is also a reviewer. And then we have Angelo Raffaele, whom you know very well, as you know the other two guests. He is one of the first IT professors in Italy.
Quindi più esperto di informatica.
So I don't know if there's anyone who knows better than him. He also is in favor of freeware, free software. He also directed the CSI in Piedmont, the computer center, and I would like to give the floor to them. But before, I must also call the two youngsters.
Invito intanto a prendere posto.
Come and sit down. And for our speakers who were looking at that instrument, that's a gong, and it can be played or sounded by our two volunteers who have a question each, an interruption each at any moment while you're speaker, and they can ask you to re-explain something or to illustrate it, obviously something which refers to the conference. They will have to get up and sound the gong. So please, try it out.
Ci vorrebbe un po' più di...
Bit more strength.
Direi che questa è la
Yes, that's fine. So, would you like to try the mic too? Which is a bit, is that all right?
E ne approfittiamo per sentire i vostri nomi.
Io sono Andrea.
My name is Andrea, and I'm a member of the audience.
Io sono Ingrid.
And my name is Ingrid.
Ingrid, perfetto. Allora, direi che siamo a posto, c'è tutto.
Everything's ready. We can now start with the conference. Angelo Raffaele. In the history of human beings, no technology has ever had such progress such as the one as we have seen with IT throughout its history. To give you an idea of how important this progress has been, I have gathered some data that refer to the 1986-2016 period. The reason why I chose those 30 years is that for 2016 I had consolidated data, and in particular I wanted to thank the friends and cooperators who have written the history of Internet in our country for these 30 years. The results that were celebrated a few months ago. So let us now start. The progress of technology. The main protagonist of this mini story is the transistor. The transistor is the object that you can see there on the right. As it arrived in the market a few decades ago, it was about 1 centimeter at the time, and which subsequently, since it was 3 layers of silica that was slightly different from a chemical and physical point of view, was also incorporated in growing volumes on a silica substrate or substratum. In 1986, the size of the transistor, once it had been incorporated, was 1.5 micrometers. That is to say, 1.5 thousandths of a milliliter. millimeter. I referred to different measurements other than the standard one. And because I'm comparing it also to Mezzalama's work, and I referred to what he was doing. I introduced this kappa Q, which is the thickness of a hair, and we refer it in particular to a football player who's well known for his hair too. Now, in 1986, it was 0.01 of one of Quadrado's hairs, and now it's 11 nanometer, that is to say 0.000007 of Quadrado's hair. Progress of a factor of 136. To simplify the account, let us pretend it is 100. Now, when a transistor becomes narrower, it also becomes lower, which means that on the same surface you can have 10,000 transistors of the old ones. 100 by 100 is 10,000, and here you can see two of the key components of microelectronics, one from 1986 and one from 2016, and the relationship has to do, it's 32,000 times greater. When it becomes smaller, it becomes also faster, because you reduce the distance that the charge must pass to determine the transistor. This means that 30 years of progress means 100% for the size by 100 for speed, which means 1,000,000. And in fact, the second one, the more recent one, is 8 million-fold bigger in terms of the processing ability, but much smaller. Here you can see the number of transistor per chips. This has determined a major innovation in products. Product innovation is great, from dishwashers to the fighter planes. They all contained lots of transistors. How many? Well, here I have tried to summarize the number of transistors that we know of. Well, humans, men and women living on this planet, are roughly 10 to the power of 10. We still haven't reached 10 to the power of 10, but we're very close to it. But I discovered through the internet that for every man and woman who lives on this planet, there are on our planet 1,850,000 ants. I don't know how they calculated it, but in any case, it doesn't surprise me, because there are 10 to the power of 7 ants live on my terrace and have been trying to colonize my dining room. Uselessly, my wife fights them and uses mass destruction weapons, but never obtains the final result. For every ant living on the planet, we have 10 transistors, which means that for every human being, 10 million transistors exist, a number which is really surprising. I'm now going to move on to another chapter, which refers to transmission, which is used optical fiber, which can be considered as if it were the jewel of the scenario of technologies used for transmission. One of those very fine glass fibers that you can see on the left, which is 10 micron, which costs 2 centimeters per meter, can transmit at 1,000 kilometers without any retransmission a volume of data which corresponds to 10 terabytes, 10,000 billion, which is virtually the equivalent of the entire phone system of the world. The last time I came here, no, the one but last time I came here, we spoke about 3D printers. Do you remember, Bianucci? A 3D printer is an object such as the one you see. It costs about 1,000 euros, which is able to translate a drawing into a physical object. That day, we had produced a little tiny dwarf using plastic material. And for the time being, 3D printers mostly use plastic. But history has already moved on, and 3D printers are producing metal objects as well. Furthermore, it started to produce prototypes, and while now, in fact, we foresee that we will have a 3D printer, and when you need an object, instead of going off to buy it, you will build it after having downloaded the design. That day, and we're talking about 5 years ago, at the time, I referred to a strip that I loved when I was a child. Most of the people here don't know what I'm talking about because it came much later. It was called Professor Alembic and his magic paint. And this paint was magic because if you painted over an image or a photo, it materialized them. From the window of my room, I could see, for instance, a beautiful red bike on a poster. My dream was, in fact, to go there by night and to extract the bike from that poster. The magic paint became a reality. When I was a bit older, in fact, I dreamt of an application of the magic paint, which was different from that of bicycles. This is not totally unreasonable in the sense that in nature we do have magic paint. It's a ribosome. In fact, it takes the messenger RNA bits and translates it into proteins. But the science that is incorporated in the world that surrounds us is more complex than the one which we have developed, which is why I am absolutely certain that in the course of history, Homo sapiens will never have the production line for young girls. And being older now, I think this is good, but the production time for youngsters will always be 17, 18 years, which is incompatible with market needs. And this that is to say, the applications of the production line is one of the examples of fake news, which Marco Mezzalama will be talking about. This is an example of this news that I read. That is to say, where a great guru who said, just as 40 million years ago Homo sapiens destroyed Neanderthals, the question is, will Homo sapiens be destroyed by calculator sapiens? Again, this is worthy of a fake news championship. I would say the fake news championship is growing. Now this, which you can see in conclusion of the first part, is the representation of Professor Alembic's magic paint, that is to say the 3D printer, which was on the cover of The Economist. In the article that followed, the journal or magazine defined it as a symbol of the third industrial revolution. So 5 years have gone by, and at this point we've entered the fourth industrial revolution, which was promoted and pushed mainly by IT technology, but this is the topic which Marco Mezzalama will be talking about. I wanted to share a few comments on this digital revolution, the technological basis of which are the ones that Mayo was describing. That is to say, the ability to produce in a small little square all the transistors that are the fundamental building blocks to develop processors that are extremely powerful and very fast. But what are we going to do with all these processors? And furthermore, what are we going to do with the software which these processors develop? Well, there are three different aspects that I would like to share with you, and which are the ones that I call the basic triad of technology, which underlies the digital revolution, and which are the Internet of Things, big data, and artificial intelligence. Let us first preface what I'm going to say. That is to say, computers were established to be used, created to be used by human beings. So we've got, say, a desktop. But the world has changed, and computers now are entering things. In our car, for instance, so we have 4, 5, or 6 processors. And now there are also processors on clothes that make them smart clothes because they can monitor your heartbeat. And I play tennis as well as being a soccer fan. There are some rackets that have a little computer inside, and at the end of the game or after an hour will tell you how many times you made a mistake, how many backs and how many slashes you did. That is to say, what is changing and what is changing in the world is that computers have become so small and so cheap, but very powerful, are invading the world of things. And there are lots, because see what I wrote down there. In 2017, the number of processors, that is to say calculators, exceeded that of the world's population. This is basically the new version of Internet. It's called the Internet of Things. That is to say, that Internet that initially was established to help human beings dialogue or exchange information at a distance now makes things dialogue. Those tiny processors that are inside elements, so much so that I always basically current IT is based on 2 commandments. That is to say that there will be a processor in every object. In fact, there is one, or within every being, but we will talk about that later, because that refers to the relationship between computers and artificial intelligence. And then every object or person will have an internet address. So the basic paradigm is that you should have the ability of having intelligence and connectivity amongst objects. Give me an example, you might say. The other day, as I was going home, I took a photo of one of these smart bikes. The clear example is that bicycle. It's a smart thing. In fact, it has a processor and it is connected. It knows where it is, and it has a GPS for that. So there's a processor that is able to connect to satellites and understand where it is. Then this information with another processor and with the Internet of Things is transmitted to a computer, not to a human being, to a computer, so that they know who rides her. So if you are going to ride it, you have to dialogue with this computer, and the bike knows that through an app you have become the legitimate, because you also have thieves, but those are not worried about GPS. You have legally using that bike. That bicycle, if I remember when I was a child and I had my bike, it really had nothing intelligent. That bike is a smart bike in that it is able to communicate and to process information. The Internet of Things has another application which is very important for all of us, and that's Domotics, a smart house. A smart house means that all the objects that we have surrounding us communicate amongst themselves and that we can control them at a distance. But in fact, they can be so smart that there are some houses that can calculate the position of the house in relation to the sun. They rotate the house so that the surface of the window panes that are basically solar panels can absorb the greatest amount of energy possible. But if you think of it, what is happening now and which will happen more and more in the future is that, say, you put your alarm on for 6, 7, 8, whatever. The alarm computer is connected with the oven, which will automatically heat your buns. So when you get up, the buns are already cooked. We'll put the water on so that you can have a hot shower. All of this is linked to those two elements, those two paradigms which I mentioned. That is to say, objects are smart, they're intelligent because there's a processor, and they are able to communicate amongst themselves. The fact that these objects communicate amongst themselves and that we communicate with them, I think in our pockets we have at least one mobile phone. Even if we don't use it, that generates information all the time. That is to say, it is linked to the cell, and it is constantly linked to the GPS to purchase, to understand, and to give that information. This means that we're surrounded by objects that generate an incredible amount of information. This incredible amount of information is one of the elements which characterizes our century, which is the hallmark of our century, the period we're living. That is normally called the problem of the big data. That is to say that there's a lot of data. And I must make a remark at this point, which I think Mayor will refer to again. I think that one of the big revolutions that we're currently experiencing is that there is an explosion of information, and that to access information is cheap and you can do it very quickly. When I make conferences, I always give this example. When I was in primary school, in a small village near Vercelli, if I'd been asked what the capital of Mongolia was, I didn't have Google, but I went home, and probably there was no atlas at home, so I had to go to school or to the library, and possibly we didn't have an atlas, or ask the teacher. So I had a difficulty in accessing information, not understanding it, which is yet another problem, but it was difficult. There was a structural difficulty in accessing information. Digital information has destroyed all this. In fact, it has basically brought our ability to know, and it has spread it regardless of the social background, the age, and the work that you do. Accessing information has become a fundamental element for the growth of society. But I'm sure that Mayor will be saying something about this. How much is the data? How much data are we producing? For example, think that every day data produced exceeds that produced of 6 centuries of printed paper. I'll give you a few examples. Every day we exchange 100 billion emails. 100 billion emails every day. There we have on Facebook 700 million photos. In other words, we're experiencing a world where data are not only surrounding us, but in fact are suffocating us. I'll give you another two examples. 100 gigabytes per Boeing currently every hour generates 100 gigabyte. And in every minute of video surveillance in the London Underground generate 1.5 terabytes. So the problem nowadays is not the problem of having information, but being able to extract the information that you need from the mass of information. One day I remembered I was thinking of War and Peace, that I thought was very, very, of course we can have different opinions, I thought it was very, very boring. I remember it is a very thick book with thousands of pages and so on. So the information that we generate every year it corresponds to 323 billion volumes of Tolstoy's War and Peace, because our digital society generates a lot of information and a lot of data. Precisely because the data is a lot, it has to be processed, and the human brain cannot do that. So, to a degree, to manage and process all that data, we have to use tools that have to be compatible with the production of the data. And these elements, not data, are computers. Finance doesn't exist without computers anymore. That is to say, the transactions from the stock exchanges are based on computers that independently make decisions. That figure that I had put on the top left, where there were the people. Do you remember in the movies, there's always that, buy this, sell that, so on the stock exchange. It doesn't exist anymore. Doesn't exist. BlackRock, which is the biggest fund investor in the world, and that has 5,000 billion euros, that is to say, the equivalent of Italy and France together. 5% of its investment, which is a lot because we're talking of 5% of that, is autonomously carried out by a computer, or should I say by a processing system, because it's no longer even a computer. And here you have a topic which I'm going to start off, but I'm sure that I would like to leave our friend De Martin to develop. The real problem is with all this, we are leaving a digital trace, millions of digital trace that is interpreted by someone. In fact, I was calculated as I was coming here. This morning, I left home. As soon as I leave home, the system, say the company, the team company, because I shouldn't have said it, but that's the one I subscribe to. I can always change companies, of course. Knows exactly where I was. So somewhere in a computer in Italy and also in the world, it says exactly where I am or was. Then I took a car. And I went up Corso Moncalieri, and then I stopped because I had to fill up with petrol. I paid with a credit card. In the moment in which I used the credit card, I was automatically traced. So it says somewhere in some computer that at a certain time I spent number of euros in a very precise moment. And that journey from where I live, I was probably intercepted by 30 or 40 video cameras that transmitted and memorized that I was passing there. So the problem, which is bit like Hamlet's dilemma, is that there is something in this technology that manages to know everything about everyone. On the other hand, if you want to discover what soccer team I am a fan on, if you go onto my Facebook page, you see that there is a Bilbao. Unfortunately, this is the last time my soccer team won the championship. But then if you go and you can discover what my wife is called, my cats, and I don't really use Facebook a lot. But again, if I want to enter, generally at home we have the neighbor's Wi-Fi. I'm an old hacker, I'm going to confess. So I try to understand other people's. If you want to go into somebody's website, because people put passwords, the ones that they remember easily, which are therefore linked to parts of their lives. No more than a fortnight ago, I entered. I didn't do anything. I went in and out. I didn't steal anything. In a neighbor's Wi-Fi. What did I do? I went on Facebook. I saw what the name of his dog was, what his passions were, what his daughter's name was, a series of things. 5 attempts, and I entered. Was he for the Toro or for the Juve? Toro. That's why you didn't do anything, because he is a fan of your football team.
Però mi permetto di condividere con voi una riflessione.
But I would like to share some comments with you now.
L'ho scritto perché l'ho preso da
I took this from an Indian story of a Sioux chief who was saying, in other words, what I'm saying. Information is something which brings the datum, but it's not knowledge, because knowledge is the critical understanding of information, and knowledge is not necessarily wisdom. So I think we have to be very careful, and this is what I tell my students, that if we have a lot of information, it doesn't mean that we have great knowledge, because you have to critically process knowledge. And if you don't critically process it, you're not real intelligent human beings. The last chapter, this is a topic that I'm fascinated by. When in 1972 I graduated, and my tutor was the very important man sitting next to me, we had the problem of getting computers to speak. That is to say that they could speak, because speaking and understanding it was one of the basic things that will characterize human beings, as it is now. This didn't mean recording and then repeating. It meant building sentences, sentence building, so that computers, to a degree, could have a model of our head, of our system, to generate sounds, and that this would generate sounds in an automatic manner. So that seemed a big challenge of artificial intelligence. Am I right? Yes. So I remember that my mother was a teacher. I brought the children, so we're talking about 1972, and my mother, and I wrote up a sentence on the computer, and the computer spoke. And at the time, they were all surprised, and they said, "What will happen?" Now, why this? Because in the end, the fact that you get the computer to do what is most intimate in our being, that is to say, what has to do with the brain, has always been a big challenge. And I must say that unfortunately or luckily, I'm leaving this to the future, but we are reaching the point where computers are starting really to learn. Because what is the biggest ability that we have? It's that of experimenting and to use the experience that we have to program our future. Here we have Konrad Lorenz, the etologist, who said that the survival of animal species, not only human species, is linked or depends on the ability to learn and therefore to learn new knowledge or acquire new knowledge from experience. Well, artificial experience in 1986, thanks to these two gentlemen, had a leap forward that depends on the ability to create in an artificial manner through a software the equivalence of a neural network. That is to say, to do something that matches human processes. But the human mental processes, as Lawrence said, are basically linked to the ability to acquire experience. Well, currently computers are able, thanks to technology, to the neural technology, not only to do something, to do one thing, which is that what they were programmed for, just like the computers up to the year 2000, but to be able to learn in the course of their lives what happens, and on the basis of what happens to make decisions. So, to build an experience on the basis of which you can then make decisions. So if you think about it, this is the basic essence of thinking and of the human brain. What can you do with this? You can do very positive things. For example, the self-driving car is based on artificial intelligence. As remote robot surgery, these are very interesting and important applications that may lead to significant solutions which are economically viable for the problem of health. Remote diagnosis and treatment, therefore the possibility of being able to identify and transfer your results and have somebody who diagnoses it. And maybe this person is a computer. I was reading, I don't know whether it's a fake news or not, because as an engineer I would like to have seen it, that the best diagnostic of skin cancers in the US is a computer. Because it has built a database, because very often it's based on experience. Diagnosis is based on experience, on the ability to interpret what you've seen. It is able to memorize so much information that it manages to diagnose correctly. I have no evidence, but it might be true. All this leads to a revolution in industry, because now industry is basically linked to digital technology. It is linked to the fact that every object has a computer, and that when it moves, it says where it is, and that there is a robot that is programmed that modifies it, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about all those topics which were illustrated by the picture. I'll go for a moment on this topic, which I find very disquieting. In 2040, the processing ability of computers will exceed that of human beings and of thinking species. Minsky, who was the great founder of artificial intelligence, in 1970 used to say this, which I always say, that sometimes keeps me awake at night, at least makes me think. Human beings is the in-between step between monkeys or apes and computers. And what is the future? Well, the future has major question marks and major doubts, because if in 2050 80% of intellectual and manual jobs, and I say intellectual too, will be by robots, well, then we will have problems. Or those who will be still alive in 2050, this technology, this digital technology, has a fallout on the social, ethical aspects, which, in my opinion, must be aware amongst the present and future generations. However, I must say I don't really think that a computer will fall in love or will have those passions that when my favorite soccer player Belotti scores, although I'm a little bit disquieting, because at a certain point I might go into the kitchen and nothing works because, say, the washing machine fell in love with the fridge.
Io volevo sapere in che modo
I would like to know in what way information and the information of the human brain can be compared with the information from computers or any other technological tool. How can we compare it? Well, it's very difficult for me to answer this because I haven't really understood this. But the real question is that we have some modus operandi. The human beings have cognitive abilities. That is to say, our brain memorizes and builds information, so has neuronal networks, synapses, so on and so forth. This ability that we have to memorize or to acquire information and to acquire information from our senses and to process them is something which at the present moment we are transferring to a machine. Transferring it to a machine means that we human beings are trying to put in that machine a series of mechanisms which are basically software that is emulating the model which we have in the brain. I'm not sure whether that was an answer. Yes, I was wondering how information, well, what is information? What type of information? Say, for example, you can have that information both in the brain and in the computer. When you look at that lamp, what in fact you're doing is that in your brain you have a datum, which is a representation of that lamp, which so you have memory of it, and the computer does exactly the same thing. They do something and then they represent the object. So it's within the head of the computer or in the head of the human being, although with a different MO, because we say in the head of a human being there is a model, a constructive model based on chemistry, while in the computer it's based on bits. But in fact, in these two objects, in your PC or in your mobile, when you take a photo, that photo is information, it's data. Just like when you look at that camera, and when you look at the camera, you create images within your head. So maybe it was more on the quantity of information. Yes, I'd like to understand the point of contact between the information and the information that the computer has. What about, are you talking about quantity? Well, the way in which it works. If there is a point of contact between the two different ways in which you process it, human and machine, from a numerical point of view, we have 100 billion neurons, if I remember it rightly. Neuronal networks are able to be the equivalent of the brain of, say, a frog. So they have the ability to process that is the equivalent of a frog. But that's in 5 years. So there's a growth that is exponential. I won't see it, but maybe I'll see 2030, I don't know. Say 2050, which you will see, but I won't. That will be the ability which is equivalent to the human being. But then we have to understand whether all we feel is rational. And being rational can be represented through a mathematical model. Then at that point it can be developed by software, but that's philosophy.
Allora, Juan Carlos De Martin, prego.
Grazie. Allora,
Now, Juan
buonasera a
Carlos
tutti.
De Martin, thank you very much. Good evening to you all.
Passo indietro, non so in quale direzione.
What I would like to try and do is a step back, I don't know in which direction, to try and contextualize what we're saying on digital technology in a bit wider way, or more comprehensive manner. And I will try to talk with you on the relationship between technology and society. What I have seen over these past 20 years, during which I have studied the relationship between the digital world and internet in particular and society, is that there has been a critical over-enthusiasm for what is happening. Myself too involved. I don't say that I was untouched by it. And we've used technological instruments like idols, and there are some examples that I will show you as if they were some myths. There are many myths. For example, the myth of the two boys who invented something in a garage and became billionaires. This has happened. Completely false, because it's not exactly like that. There are never only two boys, there's a third, but there was also somebody who funded them with a few $1 million, and usually that's not mentioned. Or else another myth, which has become a cult, as in the case of Macintosh and Apple, which is quite clear. This is a cover of The Economist, the same journal or magazine that Professor Mayer mentioned, and I think it was Jobs' cult. And then how, just like in religious cults, there are people who spend days before a new device comes out to buy it first, but nobody's seen the device. So philosophers say it's a religion, because no one has seen this object, and you spend many hours or even nights sleeping out for it to appear is a religious phenomenon. By definition, technology is seen as something inevitable and positive. So we often hear people, well, you can't do anything about it. Of course this will happen, and as if this were something inherently positive. Not only digital, but also a lot of other technology. In particular, before the year 2000, until a few years ago, this was particularly true. And I'm referring to what was said on television and newspapers. And anybody criticizing immediately was defined as a Luddite. If you don't accept the inevitability, you're a Luddite. And it's very interesting, because if you go and see, Lud possibly never existed, is more of a mythological person here. Ned Ludd is represented in the 19th century picture, but at a certain point there was a movement destroying machines, and we will see whether this will happen again. What I would like to question with you when we're talking about digital world is a relationship, as indicated in this slide, that is to say technology that has an impact on society, one directional. That is to say there is technology and it has an impact on society, and people maybe think there's nothing we can do. However, technology does not appear from nowhere. Technology is not self-generated. It's not suddenly that those transistors started to exist and were grafted onto silica. There is nothing impersonal in technology. And to quoting this fact that technology doesn't just happen, and quoting Federico Caffé, who was a famous economist, I've paraphrased it, technology is generated by forces that have name, surname, nickname. He was referring to the markets. He said the markets don't exist. Everything has name, surname, and nickname. In the case of technology, the same is true. So when you have a new app or a new device or whatever, behind that new app, there is a specific history, people who developed this technology, people who had the money, employed journalists, public relations, and so on. So in fact, we start to complicate this slide. There are humans, technology, because technology is a product of humanity, of humans. Then they produce technology that in turn has an impact on society. But at this point, we're starting to complicate the picture and to help people understand that initially we introduced humans and put them at the top of the chain, and not only as passive receivers of technology, but everything becomes complicated in that society reacts on technology and on human beings who produces. I'll give you an example of these past few years. Facebook, which we've been talking about every day now in papers and television, because it didn't exist, that one company has 2 billion people who use it every day. So good reasons to talk about this strange object that is Facebook. Well, when you have a controversy on Facebook, which means that Zuckerberg and his men, for example, developed a certain technology that had an impact on society, for example, fake news or anything else. Then it explodes. You talk about it. The first reaction that Zuckerberg is systematically, we've nothing to do with it. It's just technology. It's just an algorithm. It's nothing to do with us. But then the controversy will no longer accept this. The debate continues, and after a week or two, Zuckerberg makes a second press release. We thought about it a bit better. In fact, maybe there is a problem in the way in which we circulate fake news. We will change technology. This is an example of retroaction. That is to say, society says things don't work that way, and it impacts both the humans, but also to do it now. So it's a very complicated relationship because there are a lot of experts who've been studying sociology of science, philosophy of science, historians of science, study all this very clearly. So we have to understand this very complicated relation, and we can give a little contribution. Professor Mezzalama and Professor Mayo have said that if we have, without prejudice, without a positive or negative prejudice, we will not, if we don't analyze it, we will not understand. There's some people who are over positive and some people who say humans are overwhelmed by machines and so on and so forth. This is a law because Kranzberg's law, when I mentioned it a few years ago, they didn't understand it, but now they do. Kranzberg was a historian of science, technology historians, and when he was the chairman of the American Society, he wrote some laws. And the first one, and this is the begin, technology per se is neither good nor bad. This is just the beginning, however, because it says technology is neither good nor bad. A lot of people say, and I said it too, but in fact, it's what we say naturally, especially as a technologist. I say this, we only write technology. It's not good or bad. It depends on the use. If it were true, technology per se would never be a problem, and the problems would only emerge from the use. This is a very comfortable position because it absolves the technologists. and it places the responsibility on the user. But the first law of Kranzberg continues. It says technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. That is the first law. This is a very simple addition, but it's a key one, because what did that mean? What does it mean? It's very simple. It means that it has consequences. It generates consequences. For example, think of Noble, who'd invented dynamite, stabilizing glycerin, but when he manages to do it, there were consequences, positive and negative consequences. There are consequences, and Alfred Nobel is the example that of someone who didn't forget or exclude his responsibilities. Technology has consequences. Equally exploring its negative and positive potential is important. We also have to consider the limits of technology, and I'm saying it as an engineer. Not all problems have a technological solution. The Silicon Valley approach, which suggests that from hunger in the world to anything has a technological solution, has become a bit of a joke. There's no app that will feed people. There's not an app that will solve inequality. There's not an app that will give everybody a decent life. There's only politicians who say that. So there's also another aspect. And Professor Mayo was saying it, one of the relationships is the ethical one, since technology has consequences. Ethics is very important. There are consequences, and if there are consequences, as well as all the other legal, etc. aspects, you have to talk about the ethical aspect. We're talking about ethics of the digital world, which has become a very important topic in the past 2 or 3 years. And since technology is a human product, it should undergo the same ethical scrutiny. We haven't got time tonight here, but this was something which the world of science has had to deal with. Bianucci will talk to you about the ethical problems that there were after the World War II, in particular in physics. Ethics in technology is an enormous area, and I would just like to point your attention, without explaining it, that there is a door that we can use to enter this. And I'm going to suggest that we refer to a very eccentric thinker, Neil Postman, who wrote very important things on technology and school, etc. And Postman, in one of his last books, tried to say, ask yourselves a question. Instead of saying an essay on moral philosophy, ask yourselves questions. And there were 5 questions. Each one of these would in fact require a discussion per se, but we haven't got time. These questions are subversive. What is the problem that this technology solves? Whose is the problem? Because maybe it's not my problem, maybe it's somebody else's problem. Which people and which institutions could be seriously damaged by this technology? What new problems could emerge and may ensue from having solved the problem, and what type of people and institution can gain political and socio-economic power following the change. And here we have, in fact, another philosopher, Jacques Ellul, and he raised 76 questions, reasonable questions, in the presence of technology. And there is ethical, moral questions, all sorts of them. The digital revolution is an extraordinary opportunity, but also, as Professor Mayer and Professor Mezzalama said, a lot of questions and a lot of problems, and many problems are openly discussed. The easy optimism that we had a few years ago belongs to the past. In fact, as in the history of technology, all technologies had positive and negative outcomes. In some cases very different, some very negative, some very positive. And in fact, let us see some GAFAM. For example, here we have, I've listed a series of problems that have a link to the digital world, and each one is worthy of a long discussion. For example, 2 slides on the environmental problem. This is a very interesting investigation by the Washington Post on the cobalt pipeline in mines in Africa. Cobalt is one of the necessary materials for smartphones, and don't forget that nearly all the elements are in your smartphone, rare earths, and cobalt pipelines has had led to catastrophic living conditions of miners, but to produce one of the materials for the smartphone. Or here you can see, for example, the e-waste republic. That is to say, how do you get rid of the waste then? How do you dispose of the extraordinary manner? We don't dispose of it. In fact, they're sent to those 2 or 3 African countries that have not ratified any convention for the treatment of toxic materials, and they take these leftovers or the waste from the developed world. The impact on work, for example, I wanted to put Uber and the food deliveries, some of the many examples of how the digital is going, because one is, for example, transport of people and transport of food, which would not exist without digital. So digital has made it possible to have this type of change, and the change in work, which was something I was talking about with yesterday at the Circo dei Lettori, which is a readers club, last night. It's a side effect of digital. All the topic of surveillance. I put Edward Snowden here because he gave us the proof of what many of us suspected with reference to surveillance in public places in the US and in all the allied countries. But here, and we've heard Professor Mayer and Professor Mezzalama said it, surveillance around the clock. The phone that we have, in fact, is an element of surveillance, not only because it tells us where we are, because all the sensors on a smartphone are measuring if I'm sitting down, if I get up, if I sit down, if I walk up the stairs. When I bring it close up or make it more or less luminous according to the general light, researchers a year and a half ago discovered that this sensor, which produces this information, can be accessed through app, and with this information it's possible to know how big the person's house is, whether it's positioned east, west, or north, south, or what floor they're on which floor, and associated with the GPS information can tell you, for example, how much the person's house is worth. They are not irrelevant or innocuous information. Economic concentration. We're living in a period of great economic difference, and inequality, which we're talking about by the digital giants, the so-called GAFAM, the Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook are examples of inequality. Here you see that the recent stock exchange capitalization in billions exceeds $4 trillion for these companies which in principle, not only Apple with its reserves of cash, which are currently in tax havens, I was reading, could buy Goldman Sachs. They won't buy it because no one can buy Goldman Sachs, but it could in principle. And here you can see the individuals. Jeff Bezos, who is the Amazon founder, the richest man in the world, $112 billion, but all the others too are not doing too badly. You see the ICT world, and we have we're talking about trillions of dollars of personal capital, which is a problem for democracy. In fact, these companies and more traditional companies, and not too far from where we are today, refused to pay tax or didn't or paid very few. But these are a step forward. That is to say that they manage immaterial goods, maybe affects our imagination a bit more. For example, Amazon paid no U.S. income tax for 2017. Or that Apple has successfully avoided $50 billion in American taxes, they will save, thanks to President Trump's recent decision. They are saving a lot of money in spite of bringing some money back from tax havens. Amazon is increasingly suspected of being a monopoly, which could be like the Standard Oil at the beginning of the 20th century, but with additions which to do with the fact that it's digital, or the fact that it can discriminate on the price very subtly. Professor Mezzalama, who likes the Toro football team, he will identify it, and I will charge him more for it. Done it like this is forbidden, but it's done in a more subtle form. Dystopian price discrimination. And lastly, Bill Gates, the second most richest man in the world, who has great philanthropic problems and would like to solve problems. And saying this, it seems to be wonderful. And there's a positive aspect because he gives billions of dollars for important problems. But in the US, it's controversial because the education policy of the US is virtually dictated by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there are a lot of people who say, on the basis of what democratic principle? Only because you're very rich. You can say that the entire education system in the US must go in this idea, except after a few years he said, oh, I made a mistake. Excuse me, let's go back and let's turn to something else. Artificial intelligence, which Professor Mezzalama has spoken on, artificial intelligence, monopoly, privacy, and democracy. It's a very appealing technology, and a lot of people are discussing the ethical impact. This was carried out in Rome at the Vatican University with Jeffrey Sachs, and there's a very strong interest, and I was really surprised that the Vatican is so interested in it with different orders. They're saying artificial intelligence, but they're talking about digital revolution. What is the consequence for human beings? I will conclude with the image, which is the strongest one, which a movement of scientists in all the world are asking for an international treaty to ban, they call autonomous war system, but we could translate it with killer robots as a definition. And they want because they can autonomously decide to kill or wound a human being. We think that this is an enormous risk, equivalent to nuclear weapons, or even possibly from certain points of view more than that, and which it should be banned. And so there is national and international lobby on this. I would like to conclude in saying that it is up to us how the digital revolution will develop. Why? Because it is a political issue. And according to the social context that we're in, technology can take one direction or the other. It can develop in one direction more than the one. Depends on the context. If you, for example, take weapons in feudal Japan, it's completely different than the context of weapons in France in the 18th century. And so from our point of view, the ultimate objective is the democratic control of technological evolution, all of them. But today we're talking about digital ones, but in particular, therefore, the digital ones.
Attenzione, è arrivata la seconda domanda.
Right, beware, you've had the second question now.
Come si può perseguire questo
How can you pursue that objective? I think that in the example that you gave, you can see the consequences of a technology once it has. The fact that Gates is so rich, for example, that he can influence education is something we understand now, and he is unquestionably very, very rich, or Amazon dominating the market. This emerges when Amazon has already become the dominant actor. How can you pursue these objectives? I feel that the questions that you have on technology are questions that are theoretical. It's impossible. Is it impossible to answer unless you've already seen the impact of technology? Because there are so many possibilities in the world that it is difficult.
Assolutamente chiarissimo, però non sono d'accordo.
Yes, very clear, but I disagree in that what happens is that someone, and I thinks of technology, wants to develop it, has a certain objective, and at that point puts it on the market and tries to obtain this objective. So someone has already answered those questions. Only they've answered privately. What we're interested is in a public, democratic response and answer. At this point, it joins the political arena, and we say that a certain representation is given and that we should question in practice the fact that you can contact or control people's lives without any filters. Let us answer these questions and then try to understand what the social consequence is, not 10 years after. But the answer is political. In our social and economic context and in our institutional one, we have not created the counterforts, that is to say, the counterweights that will balance it. This is also true for chemical introduction or any other introductions or new events. But in other areas, there are controversial ones. I'm thinking of GMOs or other environments. So there are political debates. I think you can do it ex ante, but because of our system, very often the debate is ex post. We could change this. Thank you.
Angelo, Raffaele, per la conclusione.
Sì. Nel 1980 o 1980
In 1980 or 81, some very authoritative groups with very important personalities dealt with the following issue. How come the gap between the rich and poor countries has increased? I'm referring to the Brandt report that was called North-South, which had been promoted by McNamara, who was at the time the chairman or the president of the World Bank, or the Jean-Jacques Scribert, and who was one of the driving forces behind the German economic development, and then the Mitsubishi and the Pichet reports. All the reports agreed on one fundamental issue, that is to say, the advent of IT has changed the rules of the game. In fact, the product of IT has a contents which has a zero energy issue, but more intelligence. And as Descartes said, intelligence is equally distributed throughout all the peoples of the earth. You have the condition for a new social revolution that would guarantee poorer countries to close the gap. Well, a few years later, in 1986, I had the honor of introducing the Polytechnic academic year, that is to say, having the introductory lecture. There were many colleagues, the people who were important in this city, the Minister of University, who at the time was the Right Honorable Falcucci, and about 100 students who were at the back of the lecture hall. In that report, I reached the same conclusion. I copied the conclusion of the Brandt report, and I closed with the slide, which was this, although at the time it was drawn for an overhead projector. This overhead projector represented the future seen from an Italian point of view, with reference made to our country and how we could close the gap. This future was built on the basis of IT and was based on close cooperation throughout the world. Here you have an Italian researcher working on the DEA accounts, a wonderful company at the time. The person who looks dressed like an Eskimo, an Inuit, works for IBM, and in China they are programming the self-driving system for Fiat.
Bene, vorrei...
Now, at this point, I would like to say that it wasn't only bad luck, that I am a cause of bad luck. Bad luck is to do also with our leadership. We, for example, have a cultural heritage that is equal to none, and the scientific part of our culture is lacking in Italy. We have more of an arts leaning, and I hear there is some opinion about the fact that our leadership is not versed in the science. Here we have a Minister of Research when answering the question of a research project on IT says that the IT train has been missed. We've missed it. So we shouldn't spend any more money on it. This is another Minister of Research, magician number 2. Technology is a commodity that you can purchase at the supermarket. No need to invest in research. Magician number 3. A great industrial manager in 1995 turned down a project on the internet on the car, saying there's no future for the internet. Magician number 4, who was an economist, maybe the greatest, commenting the fact that the Olivetti Ivrea plant had closed down, said the production of personal computers has become the Cinderella in the sector. Let us leave it and close Scaramagno, which was the Olivetti plant. Now, because of time, I'll be skipping other opinions. This was one of the main characters from the world of culture, and saying the fact that young people flee and go abroad, emigrate, proves that the universities failed. We shouldn't invest in it. And here, science doesn't devour it, malls, and so on. Well, we haven't got enough time to think about those things, but going back to the general topic of Brandt's dream is something that never came true, not just in our country, but never came true even for the poorest countries of the world. The gap didn't close. Why? Why didn't Brandt's dream come true? As all the OECD reports prove, highlighting not just that in the fact that in the past 30 years, the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries has increased, but we've also have an increase in the income gap between the rich citizens and the poor citizens in the same country. Why didn't Brandt's dream come true? Well, for 2 reasons. Because of the market and because of the devil. I don't know which one is most important.
Del prodotto e clamorose economie di scala sulla scala del mercato.
What are the devil's faults? Well, here you can see it. This can be interpreted in the light of Pope Francis's equation, whereby capitalism is the devil. I haven't got the culture nor in the position to analyze all the ins and outs of the faults of capitalism. Is too complex for me, but I'm merely going to dwell upon one point, and then we'll reach my conclusion on one of the central dogma of the devil's catechism, that is to say that progress is based on competition. In fact, over the past few years, we've had great novelties that prove the opposite. The history of humanity has always been created and written by the strongest, not the wisest or the most just human beings. But every now and again there is an event which helps the just human beings. This is what happened with the arrival of information technology. The example, which again I haven't got time to dwell on, is the one of Internet, the great success of Internet. This slide refers to the progress of free software. There is a website called Sforge that has free software. This website has 1.5 million programmers who operate on thousands and hundreds of thousands of different projects. And here also we have free hardware, and I'm very pleased to take this moment to remind you that one of the chapters of free hardware started 40 kilometers from here in Ivrea. The work of those 4 or 5 researchers and teachers who developed a line of hardware for schools and for teaching. Those were called Arduin, who was a nobleman who in the year 1000 called himself King of Italy. So there are 1,000 years in between them. Maybe the fact is also due to them always meeting at the Arduino bar in Ivrea. I don't know which one is true. In any case, it is very important to stress that from the ideas of those groups, we have many different products, sensors and so on and so forth. There's a small robot that's very successful, Chinese, and that is all produced and manufactured with Arduino products. And another example, if you give me one more minute, I haven't got time again to explain this in detail, but this is a project that was developed by a couple of graduates of mine a few years ago to solve the problems of communication of those who have major problems, who are impaired of hearing and impaired of speech, a very small market. So in a market economy, you would have never have had a product, but a group of young people developed it. It's called Barluma in Piedmontese, and if you want to look for it, you'll see it. It's a very interesting project, fascinated. There's also all the new chapter on open education resources, which we've been very active on, but it's not now time to market them. And here we have to reach the conclusion. All this proves that an important phase of development can be built not on competition, as I was saying earlier on, because this is the devil's, but on cooperation. And therefore, this is our dream, Brandt's, Schreiber's, Mitsubishi and Pecet's dream, a better future for all, including the poor, based on a resource that knows no end, knowledge, and powerful technology, IT. And maybe that dream will come true, and maybe this time the devil won't win.
Grazie. Non c'è tempo purtroppo per altre domande.
Thank you. There's no time, unfortunately. And in the name of cooperation, we will close the season for GiovedìScienza. We will meet up again in November. Thank you very much.
Grazie ancora a tutti, Piero Bianucci, i gonghisti di questa sera e tutti quelli che si sono avvicendati in questa stagione. Arrivederci.